In the early hours of November 30th, 1989, Linda and her husband were sound asleep in their 12-story apartment. Linda recalls 3 figures standing at the foot of her bed. But first, before we get into it, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and let us know what case you'd like us to uncover next. The Linda Napolitano case. Ufologist Bud Hopkins worked closely with Linda to document and publicize her case. Linda explains her taking in detail in this rare interview with Dr. J.
December 30th, 1989. It occurred about 3:15 in the morning. I had just finished doing some backlog laundry, and I was working full time, and I had 2 boys to raise, and so I had all that laundry. Well, anyway, I finished the laundry and I went to bed, and it was about a week after Thanksgiving, and I don't know. I suddenly felt this numbness travel from my toes up, to the rest of my body. And I knew right away what that meant. And then I started to smell that odor again. It smelled like almonds. And so I said to myself, you know what? Before the rest of my body becomes numb, I'm just going to protect myself and my family. And I saw this creature standing at the foot of the bed. By now, my knees are numb. And then it got on top of the bed, and it crouched down, looked me straight in the eyes, and hissed. They hissed. It was gray. Before I knew it, the rest of my body was numb except my arms, so I picked up a decorative pillow, and I threw it at this creature.
Linda explains her taking in detail. She then recalls being lifted out of her window. She entered an alien vessel. Looking inside, she saw a long table and was told to remain quiet in the alien's language.
And someone, one of them, comes over to me with this thing that looks like a pick, a dental pick. A pick. And he looks at me straight in the eyes. Those eyes. Do you know that they look wet?
They look wet.
What am I gonna do? And he comes closer with his instrument and
Okay, now we're gonna turn that pain down very quickly.
And it fell back. And then I had that afterthought, well, now it's going to get even with me and hurt my family. By that time, after that, I don't know what happened. The next thing I remembered, I felt myself fall into my bed. It could have been from 8 feet or 2 feet or maybe even 2 inches, but I just plopped right back into my bed.
Bud Hopkins was an inspirational painter in New York City's art world. It would be in the 1980s where he sparked an interest in UFOs and aliens. He would write a book titled Missing Time and another book titled Intruders. Bud Hopkins would receive many letters from various contactees/abductees.
I called Bud Hopkins the next day and told him what I had experienced and what I saw in my room. I wasn't asleep. I was awake. And, I went to his residence. We talked about it. Well, anyway, about 13, 14 months later, he received a letter from supposedly 2 police officers who said they saw a craft hovering over this building, saw a woman in a fetal position with 3 creatures levitated outside the window 12 stories up.
Richard and Dan were allegedly determined to find out what happened, even going so far as to stalking Linda. In 1991, Richard and Dan would pay a visit to Linda's apartment and demanded answers in regards to what happened on that eventful night.
That's what I like about this case, actually. And you had those two policemen that contacted Bud.
So in 1991, Bud received a letter by Richard and Dan.
In late one early morning about 3 to 3:30 November 1989, we sat in our patrol car underneath the elevated FDR Drive on South Street in Catherine Slip. There was a strange oval hovering over the top of an apartment building 2 to 3 blocks up from where we were sitting. It moved out away from the building and lowered itself to an apartment window just below. We grabbed hold of each other and were going to get out of the car. But what could we do for that poor little girl or woman wearing a full white nightgown? She was floating in midair in a bright beam of whitish blue light, looking like an angel. She was then brought up into the bottom of that very large oval, about 3/4 the size of the building across. This poor person was escorted out of her window. I don't know if she was willing or not. I don't think so, because it seemed as though she was being escorted up into this thing by 3 ugly but smaller human-like creatures, 1 above her and 2 below. They seemed to be in charge. On top of our fear of getting involved, we were also carrying a load of guilt because we didn't help her and we don't know what's become of her. Behind the Brooklyn Bridge, someone else had to see what happened that morning.
Unfortunately for Linda, she was taken against her own will by Richard and Dan. Linda claims she was taken to a secluded island in Long Island, but ultimately Dan was able to get a hold of Linda, and it would be Richard who encountered the two fighting, and Richard would be the one to save Linda from Richard. Unfortunately, Dan was eventually committed to a mental facility due to their own over-the-top attempts to get answers from Linda. It's believed that the incident left Richard and Dan terrified of what they saw and scared that they might also be taken in a similar manner in the future. This case would gain attention due to the fact it may have involved the United Nations Secretary General, who at that time was Javier Pérez de Cuellar, who was also speculated to be taken alongside Linda.
Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar has never acknowledged this story.
A recent podcast by Brian Sprague, Somewhere in the Skies, a guest he had on the show, the Brooklyn Bridge UFO abduction episode, fellow guest Peter Robbins, who is a former assistant to Bud Hopkins, claims that Hopkins and de Cuellar briefly met and had an agreement that he did indeed witness the events with Miss Napolitano's abduction. However, Javier Pérez stated that he would not come forward with the account from that night on November 30th, 1989. According to an article, Skeptics UFO newsletter, Javier Pérez had been abducted along with Napolitano, but no one should contact him about this because the UN was working with aliens to end the Cold War. Here is an interview with Peter Robbins on the show, Somewhere in the Sky.
Spring of 1989, Bud received a letter from a woman who was a lifelong New Yorker, lived downtown in the same neighborhood she grew up in, mother, married, high school education, Italian American. I read the letter first. I read and responded to thousands of pieces of mail over the years, and Bud was very old school. Around Thanksgiving of that year, that she actually came and met with Bud for the first time, and he began to really research the subject with her, and we began to see things, some of them for the first time in terms of what became patterns, because we had never thought or knew to look at them. The Linda case that became known as the Brooklyn Bridge UFO abduction case, a woman on the Brooklyn Bridge driving home from a retirement party of a friend, observing this glowing light and seeing this and wondering, obviously it's a movie being made, but how are they creating this special effect? Somebody on the West Side Highway. I think he must have received at least a dozen letters with carefully done drawings. Downtown at the time, with two security people, was a very important diplomat Once Bud had established who it was, it seemed so outrageous that the book does not mention who it was. It became an open secret and now is pretty much public knowledge that it was Pérez de Cuellar, who at the time was the Secretary General of the United Nations. So one reason the case is considered controversial is, yeah, right. Please give me a break. The Secretary General of the United Nations was downtown at 2 in the morning. Why? Well, he may have had a romantic liaison. He's a married man. He was in a very important internationally diplomatic position. Be that as it may, Bud ultimately met with Pérez de Cuellar. It was in an executive lounge at O'Hare Airport in Chicago that was prearranged through de Cuellar's office, who obviously wanted to meet with Bud, but gave him a certain amount of information, but asked him a series of questions, none of which he denied, because he was involved in an abduction that Linda was.
And this world important leader were also abducted that night, right along with Linda CORTILE.
The debunkers' attack on this, of course, is that the whole thing is a gigantic hoax involving maybe 20 people. Linda would have to be paying these people all off to make up all these stories. They would all have to be trained.
Bridge, the drawing she made.
And the two security men who were with them, one of these men became obsessed with Linda. Obsessed. And that obsession was rooted in what Linda had to acknowledge at a certain point as we developed the material. Oh my God.
They were only 2 blocks away, and they were sitting under the FDR Drive in their car, and they used binoculars. And that's how they identified me, because they realized they knew what building and window that I came out of.
The other security man ultimately became completely unwound emotionally, and he disappeared off any ability to trace him. Whether he was institutionalized or just removed from the case and disallowed to communicate or not alive, I have no idea. And during that time, I met regularly with Linda, who became a good friend, as well as somebody who I felt somewhat protective of, and who I was convinced had gone through what she alleged she had gone through. I still stay in touch with Linda, who, still stands absolutely rock solid on everything that happened to her.
Live and learn.
I would just close by saying,
yeah,
I encourage everybody to read that book. Witnessed the true story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO abductions, and then come to their own best conclusions.
And specifically, 2 drivers, or 1 driver and a bodyguard in a limousine for the United Nations General, or the Secretary of United Nations. And yet he's...
Yeah, I did promise him I'd never speak his name publicly. But everybody knows who he is.
Yes, yes. Especially because his 2 people came forward. If they didn't come forward, then obviously he might have stayed anonymous. But since his driver and, of course, his bodyguard witnessed what happened, they told it, and it's pretty much a given. I'm sure in the limousine, they probably pointed at him and say, take a look at that, if it wasn't the other way around.
The functions entrusted to me as Secretary General of the United Nations.
But again, very, very interesting to see all these people. I just could not even fathom watching this. If I was driving on a bridge at night and all of a sudden cars are stopping and people pointing at a disc-shaped craft that is hovering 12 stories up, and then you see coming out, flying, literally floating, is a woman, and then you see really small toddler-sized, child-sized figures going with it. You know something's up. It's as if everything you're brought up to believe is flat out, right there. It's like it does exist.
Well, I'll tell you, up till this date, there are close to 100 witnesses.
That's why I love both of your cases as fascinating, because of the fact that you guys actually have supporting evidence in many different directions that people that actually saw craft. And as I was saying earlier with Tom Reed, Tom Warner, someone he had not met through his young childhood, actually saw on the day he was taken, the night he was taken, a craft over the farm. You guys are very unique in that sense. And I told you this off air. When each time someone speaks publicly about their case, it inspires other people. But a lot of people, you know, they're speaking from their heart when they're very sincere, and they absolutely have gone through what they have, and they've gone through regression. But you guys have that extra element of witnesses.
See, but the problem with me was that we have all these independent witnesses. At first I thought somebody was playing a joke on Bud, a cruel joke, you know? But then all these witnesses started to either contact him or contact other people who have then in turn contacted Bud. You know, and then I couldn't deny it anymore. You know, it isn't something that one wants to believe.
Right.
And, you know, it had gotten to a point, you know, I just told Bud Hopkins, God rest his soul, boy, do I miss him. A lot of people miss him. I said, but I didn't see these witnesses see me. I didn't see them see the craft because they're witnesses on different levels.
This is a video taken from Carol Rainey's in development documentary about the whole Linda case. It appears to be a video of Richard or Dan.
Two security agents, Richard and Dan, and the third man. The media soon identified the third man as Javier Perez de Cuellar. Instead, they'd sent along many typed letters and audio tapes to support their story.
My partner was very disoriented and embarrassed. This is what he said to me.
The incident wasn't just witnessed by Cuellar's bodyguards, as other citizens, in fact, witnessed the event. The book, titled Witness, also claims there were 23 other witnesses who claimed to have seen a UFO hovering above the bridge on that fateful night.
The other 100 or so people that were on the bridge, and the bridge wasn't going, everyone was stopped to look at the incident.
The witnesses came from the Fulton Fish Market. The workers down there. They were witnesses on the Brooklyn Bridge, but there was only one person that came forward. They were witnesses on the FDR Drive. They were witnesses from the New York Post newspaper. One of them was a...
So I said, I know what building that is. I've seen that building for years, but I've forgotten about it. I couldn't remember where I saw the light and what building, so I knew what building it was. As the light went back up to the window, I'm fine. Thank you, kid. It's good to see you.
You know what I want to use?
Anything you can.
Don't say who he is, because if he finds out, he might sue.
Oh,
He's a New York Post journalist. Tell him what he said to you. What happened?
okay,
He
you're
was the
worried.
one that...
You think I should worry about this gentleman? So before I tell this gentleman.
Well, I'm using his name. But you know, that's up to you. That's up to
Thank
you.
you for the consideration.
Tell him about it.
Okay. Yes.
Famous journalist.
Yes, Steve Dunleavy. He's a friend of mine.
Yeah, go ahead.
We went to different schools together. He's a noted journalist, and I've been in touch with him many times, so I have nothing to fear from the press. As a matter of fact, I welcome the press. That's why I'm here. Well, basically why I'm here is because I love this country. But more than I love this country, I love the Constitution of this country. And it's not being protected for my children. That's why I'm here. Now, Mr. Dunleavy was there, along with Robert, and everybody else in the delivery department. Bud and page 360 in a chapter called Expressways and Blind Alley. Thought that the New York was informed, I guess, that the New York Post usually has a skeleton crew and there's not many men around. But this night was a famous night at the New York Post, which is the oldest paper in America. They inserted a comic section for the first time, so everyone who worked in the delivery department, the mailings department, the press room, had to be there at 2 o'clock in the morning. They don't have, in the delivery department anyway. So you're looking about 60, 70 men in a truck. Plus the diner was filled with people working in the diner. There were many, many people, workers there. I found 3. Well, there were other people besides Linda that were abducted that night. Now, as far as worrying about my friends, I'm concerned about.
And I think we'll have to save that. No, the thing is,
no, it's okay. We're going to talk about it. It's not ladies' night out.
There's
a journalist. You know, then you have the motorcade, you know, and people are still coming forward. But the people who are coming forward recently. We don't know if they're authentic because they had already read Bud's book.
Janet Kimbo, who was a retired phone operator, traveling home from a late night party.
Janet is a woman who wrote to me, I got the letter in the fall of 1992, saying that she had witnessed a UFO above a building and people floating out a window.
Allegedly, power went out, cars stopped moving. All of those witnesses on the Brooklyn Bridge suddenly had to face something they've never seen before.
Surrounding neighborhood experiences a major power outage.
And not just in the buildings, but on the street also. Cars were dying right in the middle of the street.
Many stories off the ground described exactly what I had gotten from Richard and Dan about they're watching Linda's abduction.
Some workers of the New York Post even claim they had witnessed the event.
The only thing that I do remember seeing was like the lady and the three terrestrials back on board. They did come out, like I read, where they were spinning as if they were on a trapeze, all of them. When they got closer to the light source, they straightened out and more or less.
I mean, you couldn't see them though.
Yes, I could. When they were going up and they were entering the ship, I remember saying to myself, oh, that's it, they're filming a movie. Look, they have them on wires and they're filming a movie. Like Peter Pan or something like that. That's what I figured.
Well, how big did they look?
Small. They were small, because I was a distance away. But you could make them out. Something about the light made everything very clear.
It is interesting what Yancey Spence says about Linda's abduction. Bud Hopkins' book, Witness, chronicled Linda's incident and detailed the more unusual elements of her experience, such as when Richard and Dan took Linda in an attempt to gain answers. Sadly, this incident is still shrouded in mystery, but by combining witness testimonies, letters, tapes, and recordings from Richard and Dan, it's possible to piece together a greater understanding of what happened to Linda that night. Even today, over 30 years later, Linda lives in New York City, which she still hasn't forgotten that traumatic experience that November evening. According to Linda, quote, if I was hallucinating, then the witnesses saw my hallucination. That sounds crazier than the whole abduction phenomenon, end quote. So the question today is, where's Linda? Well, Linda is active on social media. She does have a Facebook profile. I did attempt to reach out to her in regards to any comments about the case, but unfortunately I did not receive a response.
I want to say one thing because I don't know if we have enough time, and I want to give the rest to Tom. I just want to tell anyone who's listening out there, if you feel that you're having these experiences and you're being abducted, don't lose it. Keep your feet on the ground. I'll just give you a little advice. I know you didn't ask for it, but if it is happening to you, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go in your closet, and I want you to see that everything you own, everything you wear is still there. Nothing has changed. Nothing physically has changed, except your emotions. And eventually you will get used to it. You will get used to the difference. You might not accept it, but you'll get used to it, and you'll be fine. Just keep your feet on the ground, people, okay? And life will be different, but you'll be okay. And if anybody out there wants to know more about my case, go to the website. A very close friend of mine made a website for me. It's called the LindaCortileCase.com. And if you're curious, you want to know what has really happened, that's the place to go, to that website.
Well, what do you think? Leave a comment and subscribe, and let us know what case you'd like us to uncover next. Thank you and good night.